What if the most degrading moment of your life was secretly an audition for a future you couldn't even dare to dream of? For one waitress, a few quiet words spoken in a language of her ancestors would detonate the carefully constructed prison of her life. This is not a story of chance. It is a story of how a single act of defiant dignity, performed in the hushed, judgmental halls of a Michelin-starred Chicago restaurant, was witnessed by a man who didn't just see a server, he saw a queen in exile. It is the story of an obsidian black envelope, a ticket to a forgotten world, and a challenge so profound it would either resurrect the woman she was born to be or leave her shattered in the ruins of who she had become. The scent of truffle oil and simmering resentment was the air Clara Evans breathed. It clung to the starched fabric of her black uniform, settled into the weary lines around her 24-year-old eyes, and tainted the taste of the staff meal she choked down in the windowless break room. She was a senior waitress at the Gilded Quill, a temple of gastronomy on Chicago's Gold Coast, a place that served exquisitely crafted food to people who often seemed incapable of true enjoyment. The restaurant was a symphony of hushed tones, gleaming crystal, and silent, predatory service. It was a gilded cage for the city's elite and a beautifully appointed purgatory for its staff. Each evening, Clara would affix her name tag, a simple, elegant Clara in gold script, and don a smile as professionally crafted as the swan-shaped choux pastry the kitchen was famous for. She was exceptional at her job. Her memory was a steel trap, recalling the dietary restrictions of a patron who hadn't dined there in 6 months. Her movements were fluid and economical, a ballet of efficiency around tables spaced for intimate conversations. She was the ghost at the feast, the perfect, unobtrusive servant. None of the hedge fund managers dissecting their dry-aged duck, nor the society wives complaining about the chill from the air vent, would ever suspect that Clara could read 14th century Provençal script, or that she could identify the vintage of a Bordeaux simply by the historical inaccuracies on its counterfeit label. No one knew that just 3 years prior, she had been the most promising young scholar in the University of Chicago's Paleography department, on a fast track to a fellowship at the École Nationale des Arts in Paris. Her life had been one of crumbling manuscripts, the smell of old parchment, and the thrill of deciphering the secrets of the past. Then came the diagnosis. Her grandmother, the woman who had raised her, the last of her family, was struck by a rare, degenerative neurological disease. The insurance ran out. The savings evaporated. The family's small, beloved antique bookstore, a legacy passed down through 3 generations, was sold to a soulless chain for pennies on the dollar to cover the astronomical medical bills. Clara's dream didn't just dissolve, it was brutally liquidated. She traded the hallowed halls of the university library for the polished floors of the Gilded Quill. Her fellowship application replaced by a W-2 form. Paris became a forbidden word, a pang of grief for a life that felt like it belonged to a ghost. "Clara, pick up! Table 12, hissed Jean-Pierre, the imperious maître d', his voice a venomous whisper. "And the gentleman at 7 is complaining about the condensation on his water glass again." Clara took the silver tray, the weight of it familiar in her hands. "Thank you, Jean-Pierre." Table 7 was her personal cross to bear this evening. Marcus Thorne, a real estate developer whose face was a permanent fixture in the city's gossip columns, was holding court. He was in his late 40s, with a tan that looked lacquered on, and a suit that cost more than her grandmother's last round of medication. He had already sent back a bottle of wine because he didn't like the arrogance of its bouquet, and had loudly corrected her pronunciation of Gewürztraminer. He was performing, using his wealth as a cudgel to beat the world into submission, and his much younger, surgically enhanced date was his captive audience. "And make sure," he'd said earlier, snapping his fingers so close to her face she could feel the air move, "that the chef knows what al dente means. Not crunchy, not soft. I want the echo of the bite. Got it, sweet pea?" Clara had simply inclined her head. "Perfectly, sir." As she moved through the dining room, a silent predator in her own right, her eyes did a customary sweep. In a secluded alcove booth, a man sat alone. He was an anomaly in the Gilded Quill's ecosystem. He wasn't scrolling on his phone. He wasn't trying to catch the eye of the sommelier. He wasn't performing for anyone. He was simply watching. He was dressed in a deceptively simple charcoal suit with a dark navy tie. No flash, no logos. But the fabric draped with a weight and precision that bespoke tailoring of the highest order. A quiet air of immense, unshakable power radiated from him. He had been nursing a single glass of scotch since he arrived, and every time her duties brought her near his table, she could feel his gaze on her. It wasn't lecherous or creepy, it was analytical, dissecting. She'd marked him as an old money lawyer, or perhaps an investment banker from a more venerable firm, someone for whom wealth was a native language, not a recently acquired dialect shouted from the rooftops. "Another round of Perrier for 7, whispered a junior waiter as they passed. "And he says he can hear the ice machine. He wants you to do something about it." Clara closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, a silent prayer for patience. "Of course, I'll have a word with the machine." It was just another Thursday, a slow, methodical march of refilling water glasses, describing specials, and absorbing the casual cruelties of people who believed their net worth granted them immunity from basic human decency. She was moving toward Marcus Thorne's table, a fresh bottle of mineral water in hand, utterly oblivious that this particular soul-leeching Thursday was about to become the fault line upon which her entire existence would fracture. The man in the alcove, Julian Caldwell, took a deliberate sip of his Macallan 25, his eyes following her, a flicker of something clinical and assessing in their depths. He wasn't just watching a waitress, he was evaluating an asset. The heavy oak doors of the restaurant opened, admitting a new guest who seemed entirely out of place. She was an elderly woman, perhaps in her late 70s, with a cascade of silver hair pinned into an elegant chignon. Her clothes were of a quality that whispered rather than shouted. A classic wool coat, a simple silk blouse, and a worn but clearly priceless leather handbag clutched in her hands. She looked disoriented, her sharp blue eyes scanning the opulent room with a mixture of apprehension and defiance, as if she had wandered onto the wrong stage. She approached the host stand, where a young flustered hostess was trying to manage a seating chart on a tablet. "Excusez-moi," the woman began, her English thick with a patrician French accent. "I have a trouble." The hostess gave her a bright, uncomprehending smile. "Do you have a reservation, ma'am?" "Non. My car, it has a flat tire, and my telephone, the battery is finished. I am to meet my nephew, but he is late, and I do not know this city." She was trying to explain, but her agitation was making her English crumble. She gestured helplessly. "It is complicated." The hostess's smile became strained. "I'm sorry, ma'am. We're fully booked this evening." From his table, Marcus Thorne let out a sound of profound exasperation, a theatrical huff designed to draw attention. "Oh, for God's sake, can't we have a single meal without some kind of peasant drama?" He pushed his chair back, a smug, predatory grin on his face. He saw an opportunity for a public display of his supposed sophistication. He strode over to the woman, his posture expansive. "Bonsoir, madame," he boomed, his accent a grotesque butchery of the language, something learned from a bad movie. "Je peux helpez-vous? You are perdu." The French woman stared at him, her confusion deepening into alarm. Clara, who was decanting a bottle of wine at the service station nearby, felt a hot, shameful anger rise in her chest. It was agonizing to witness. Thorne wasn't just mangling the language. He was mocking it, using it as another prop in his tiresome play of superiority. He was making a spectacle of this woman's distress. It was the same casual, entitled cruelty he had shown her all night. Something inside her, the part that remembered the hushed reverence of the manuscript room, the part that believed in dignity, finally snapped. The scholar she had buried alive began to claw her way to the surface. She placed the decanter down with a soft click, smoothed her apron, and walked towards them. In his alcove, Julian Caldwell leaned forward, his glass forgotten on the table. His stillness became absolute. This was the moment he had been waiting for, though he hadn't known it until now. Clara addressed the hostess first. "I can handle this, Chloe." Then she turned to the elderly woman, and her entire demeanor shifted. The professional mask fell away, replaced by a look of gentle, genuine concern. And then she spoke. The voice that emerged was not the polite, deferential whisper of a server. It was the voice from her other life, a voice of quiet authority and academic precision, melodic and clear. Madame, pardonnez mon intrusion, she began, her French accent not just perfect, but regionally specific, the educated, slightly formal cadence of Parisian academia. Cet homme ne vous comprend pas. Vous semblez perdu. Puis-je vous aider? Somnum. Madam, forgive my intrusion. This man does not understand you. You seem lost. May I help you? The tension in the immediate vicinity seemed to evaporate. Marcus Thorne's jaw hung open. His date's perfectly sculpted eyebrows shot up. Jean-Pierre, the maître d'idée, froze mid-stride. The French woman's face, however, was transformed by a wave of profound relief. Oh mon Dieu, oui! She exclaimed, her hand flying to her chest. She burst into a torrent of French, the words now finding a safe harbor. She explained that her driver had gotten a flat tire a few blocks away. Her phone had died, and she was supposed to be meeting her nephew for the first time in 10 years. He was flying in from San Francisco and was meant to meet her here, but she was now late and had no way to contact him or the car service. Clara listened with serene patience, nodding, her expression conveying complete understanding and empathy. Ne vous inquiétez pas, madame. Tout s'arrangera, she said soothingly. Don't you worry, madame. Everything will be all right. She turned to the hostess. Chloe, please seat this lady at table 16 and bring her a glass of still water. Then back to the woman in French. Please have a seat and compose yourself. Allow me to use my telephone to contact your car service. What is the company's name? And if you give me your nephew's name, I can have our staff watch for him. While the woman who introduced herself as Madame Dubois retrieved a business card from her handbag, Clara turned to face Marcus Thorne. His face was a thunderous mask of puce, a cocktail of pure fury and public humiliation. If you'll excuse me, sir, Clara said, her voice reverting to its cool, professional tone, the waitress mask perfectly back in place. I will go and speak to the ice machine about its volume now. She didn't wait for his response. She walked away, leaving him standing there, utterly neutered in front of his date in half the dining room. From her own pocket, she used her phone, quickly sorting out the car service. A new car was only 10 minutes away. She then spoke to Jean-Pierre, providing the nephew's name and description. Madame Dubois was effusive in her gratitude, trying to press a $50 bill into Clara's hand. Clara gently folded the woman's fingers back over the bill. C'est mon plaisir, madame. J'espère que vous retrouverez votre neveu sans plus de soucis. Bonne soirée. It is my pleasure, madame. I hope you find your nephew without further trouble. Have a good evening. As Madame Dubois was comfortably settled at her table, a wave of defiant satisfaction washed over Clara. For a fleeting moment, she felt like herself again. She had forgotten the quiet power that came from her knowledge. She went to clear the appetizers from Thorne's table. He and his date were gone. On the table, beside a bill for over $400, was a single insulting penny. She wasn't surprised. What did surprise her was that the man in the alcove booth was also rising to leave. As he slipped on his exquisitely tailored coat, he caught her eye. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod, and his look was no longer just analytical. It was a look of profound confirmation, as if she had just passed a test she never knew she was taking. On his table, for a single glass of scotch, he had left 5 crisp $100 bills. Clara collected the generous tip, a small, hollow victory against the sting of Thorne's penny. She assumed that was the end of it, a brief, satisfying flare of her old self in an otherwise bleak landscape. She had no idea that it wasn't the end. It was the ignition. The rest of her shift was a slow unwinding of tension. The dining room gradually emptied, the clatter of cutlery replaced by the soft hum of the vacuum cleaner. Clara performed her closing duties with robotic precision, her mind replaying the scene with Madame Dubois, the venom on Marcus Thorne's face, and the unsettling intensity of the quiet man's gaze. She was just Clara, the waitress. The scholar had been a ghost, a brief haunting. When she finally clocked out after midnight, the ache in her feet was a dull throb, but the deeper ache of her compromised life felt strangely numb. She pushed open the heavy staff door into the cool, damp air of the service alley. "Miss Evans!" She turned, startled. A man in a dark suit stood beside a gleaming black town car that was idling silently by the dumpsters. It was the quiet man's chauffeur. "My employer asked me to give you this," the driver said, his tone respectful and impassive. He held out a sleek, obsidian black envelope. It was thick, heavy, made of a cardstock so luxurious it felt like silk-covered steel. There was no name, no address. It was sealed with a simple, heavy wax seal, impressed with the image of a compass rose. Clara took the envelope, her fingers suddenly clumsy. "Who is your employer?" "He prefers to remain anonymous for the moment," the driver said. He gave a slight bow, got into the car, and it pulled away, disappearing into the Chicago night, leaving Clara alone in the alley under the single buzzing security light. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This had to be a prank, a cruel, elaborate joke orchestrated by Marcus Thorne as revenge for his humiliation. Leaning against the cold brick wall, she broke the seal, the wax crumbling under her trembling thumb. Inside were 3 items. The first was a business card, as black and substantial as the envelope. The silver compass rose was embossed at the top. Below it, in stark, silver lettering, were a name and a title that made the air rush from her lungs. Julian Caldwell, CEO, Caldwell Industries. Caldwell Industries wasn't just a company, it was a modern empire, a global logistics and private equity firm known for its aggressive, almost prescient acquisitions. Julian Caldwell was a legend in the financial world, the scion of an old money dynasty who had taken the family's considerable fortune and multiplied it tenfold. He was famously private, a phantom who rarely gave interviews or appeared in public. That was the man from the alcove. The second item stole her breath entirely. It was a thick folder, and on the first page was a reservation confirmation for a private flight on a Bombardier Global 7500, scheduled to depart from a private airfield in DuPage County the next day at 11 a.m. Destination, Bordeaux-Marignac Airport, France. The passenger's name was listed as Clara Evans. Tucked inside the folder was the third item, a small, handwritten note on matching black stationery. The script was angular and decisive, penned in silver ink. Miss Evans. Expertise should not be wasted on placating fools. A mind like yours belongs in a library, not a restaurant. You handled 2 difficult situations tonight, one with grace, the other with a dignity that bordered on defiance. I value both. There is a family-owned vineyard in Bordeaux, Chateau du Bois, that my company wishes to acquire. Its matriarch is difficult. She has rejected all of our conventional approaches. That matriarch was the woman in the restaurant tonight. You accomplished in 5 minutes what my best teams have failed to do in 5 months. You earned her trust. I am not offering you a job. I am offering you a test. A car will be at your address tomorrow at 9 a.m. Be in it. This is not a whim. It's a calculation. J.C. Clara read the note 3 times, her mind refusing to process the words. The alley seemed to sway, the city's distant sirens fading into a dull roar. A prank? This was too specific, too detailed. The mention of Chateau du Bois, of its matriarch being the very woman from the restaurant. It was impossible. But how did he know her address? The thought sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the night air. She walked the few blocks to her cramped studio apartment in a disoriented haze, the black envelope clutched in her hand like a live coal. When she let herself in, her grandmother was asleep in the hospital bed that now dominated the small living space. A hired night nurse sat in a chair, reading a book under a dim light. Clara went to her grandmother's side, listening to the soft, rhythmic puff of the oxygen machine that was her constant companion. The mountain of debt, the constant worry, it was a physical weight on her chest. In her small, partitioned-off bedroom, she laid the contents of the envelope on her worn desk. Caldwell Industries, a private jet to France. A calculation. The cynicism that had become her shield screamed at her. This was insane. It was a trap, a rich man's perverse game. No one did this. He had investigated her. The thought was both terrifying and, in a strange way, validating. Someone had looked past the uniform and seen her. But the hope, a thing she thought had died long ago, was a treacherous, vibrant weed pushing its way through the concrete of her despair. Bordeaux, the heart of a region whose history she had studied, whose archives she had dreamed of exploring. A chance to use her mind again. A chance to earn enough money to give her grandmother the best care, to live without the constant, gnawing fear of the next bill. The note said it was a test. Her entire life for the past 3 years had been a test of endurance. This was a test of skill, of nerve. She looked at the sleeping form of her grandmother, the reason for all her sacrifices. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about her. The fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. Maya's warnings were logical. The risk was enormous. But the alternative, another year, another 5 years, of serving Marcus Thorns and watching her own soul wither and die, was no longer a risk. It was a certainty. She took out her phone and searched for Julian Caldwell. The articles were sparse, mostly financial news. He was brilliant, ruthless, and obsessively private. One article mentioned his philosophy. "I don't invest in companies. I invest in leverage points. A person, a patent, a piece of information. Find the fulcrum, and you can move the world." Clara looked at the jet ticket. She was a leverage point. The thought should have been dehumanizing. Instead, it felt like a promotion. She was no longer a waitress. She was a tool, a precision instrument, and she was about to be aimed at the heart of France. "I have to go," she whispered into the silent apartment, the words feeling both like a surrender and a declaration of war. "I have to know." The next morning was a frantic ballet of quiet arrangements. Clara wrote a note for the day nurse, explaining she had a sudden family emergency and would be in constant contact. She called the Gilded Quill and resigned, leaving a polite but firm voicemail for Jean-Pierre. The act of severing that tie felt like cutting an anchor line. She packed a small suitcase, her hands shaking as she chose her few respectable items of clothing. A pair of dark trousers, a few simple blouses, and the one well-made wool blazer she'd bought for her graduate school interview. It all felt pathetically inadequate for a mission to France to broker a deal for a billionaire. Her friend Sarah, a nurse she'd met through her grandmother's care, came by for her morning check-in and found Clara standing by her packed bag. Clara explained the situation in a rushed, breathless whisper, showing her the contents of the envelope. Sarah's reaction was immediate and visceral. "Clara, no, absolutely not. This is how women disappear. This isn't a job offer. It's a plot from a thriller novel. A reclusive billionaire who had you investigated and is now summoning you to France on a private jet? You can't be serious." "He was there, Sarah. He saw what happened. This isn't random," Clara argued, though her own heart was pounding with the same fear. "And what choice do I have? Look at this place. Look at these bills." She gestured to the stack of menacing envelopes on her counter. "This isn't a life. It's a holding pattern. This is a chance. Maybe the only one I'll ever get. There are other chances. There are other jobs." "To do what? Serve more arrogant millionaires? This is a chance to be me again, even if it's just for a day." Sarah, pragmatic and fiercely protective, sighed in defeat but shifted into crisis management mode. "Fine, but you are not going off the grid. I'm putting a tracking app on your phone, and you will share your location with me permanently. You will text me when you get in the car, when you get on the plane, when you land, and every 2 hours after that. If I miss a single check-in, I am calling the State Department. I am not kidding." "I promise," Clara said, hugging her friend tightly. "I'll be careful." At precisely 9 a.m., a Lincoln Navigator, its tinted windows as black and opaque as the envelope, glided to a stop in front of her modest apartment building. A driver in a severe black suit stepped out. He didn't say a word, simply held the rear door open for her. Her name was never spoken. It was assumed. The ride to the private airfield was a silent, surreal journey through a world she had only ever seen from the outside. They bypassed the commercial chaos of O'Hare, heading instead to a discreet executive terminal where the air hummed with the quiet thrum of immense wealth. And there on the tarmac, gleaming under the morning sun, was the Bombardier jet. It was a sliver of impossible technology, a testament to a level of freedom she couldn't comprehend. A flight attendant in a chic gray uniform greeted her by name at the top of the stairs. "Welcome aboard, Miss Evans. Mr. Caldwell has instructed us to ensure your flight is as comfortable as possible." The interior was a sanctuary of quiet luxury: soft beige leather, polished dark wood, brushed nickel fixtures. It was less like an aircraft and more like a minimalist penthouse apartment that could travel at 600 miles per hour. She was the sole passenger in a cabin designed for 16. As the jet accelerated down the runway, the raw power was terrifying and exhilarating. It pinned her to her seat, and as they lifted effortlessly into the sky, she looked down at the shrinking city of Chicago. The gilded quill, her tiny apartment, the crushing weight of her life, it all became part of a map, a place she was leaving behind. She was suspended in the stratosphere, caught between a past defined by loss and a future that was a terrifying, seductive blank page. The flight attendant served her a lunch of seared scallops and risotto that would have cost a week's salary at the Quill. She ate, but barely tasted it, her mind racing. This was real. This was happening. 7 hours later, as the jet began its descent, the landscape below resolved into the patchwork greens and ochres of the French countryside. The sheer, unadulterated beauty of it made her ache. She was returning to a continent she loved, not as a student with a backpack, but as a weapon in a billionaire's arsenal. They landed at Bordeaux-Marignac, but she was spared the indignity of a commercial terminal. The jet taxied to a private hangar where a black Peugeot sedan was waiting on the tarmac. Another silent driver, another seamless transition. They drove out of the city and into the heart of wine country. The late afternoon sun slanted across endless rows of grapevines, illuminating ancient stone farmhouses and grand chateaux that stood like silent sentinels of history. The car turned off the main road, passing through imposing wrought iron gates bearing a crest of intertwined grapevines. They proceeded down a long gravel drive lined with ancient plane trees, at the end of which stood a breathtaking 18th century chateau. It was a masterpiece of pale limestone and slate, its elegant facade glowing in the golden light. The driver opened her door. "We have arrived at Chateau du Bois, mademoiselle." Clara's legs felt unsteady as she stepped out. So this was the prize. This was the fortress she was meant to breach. The massive front door of the chateau swung open, and standing in the doorway was not a butler, but Julian Caldwell himself. He was dressed as he had been in the restaurant, in a simple dark suit, but he had shed the tie. Up close, she could see the sharp intelligence in his eyes, the almost imperceptible lines of exhaustion at their corners. He was younger than she had imagined, perhaps mid-30s. "Ms. Evans," he said, his voice a low, calm baritone that held no hint of surprise. "Clara, welcome to Bordeaux. I hope your journey was acceptable." "It was overwhelming," she managed to say, feeling utterly out of her element in the grand stone-floored entryway. "Mr. Caldwell, I still don't fully understand." "Clarity is a luxury we'll work towards," he said, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "But first, a complication. Madame Dubois was so impressed with your kindness that she has invited you, and only you, to dinner this evening. My sister believes it's a trap. I believe it's an opening. Your test begins in 1 hour." Before she could process this, a woman descended the grand curving staircase. She was older than Julian, exuding an aura of crisp, no-nonsense authority. She was dressed in a severe but impeccably tailored pantsuit, her sharp gaze sweeping over Clara with undisguised skepticism. "So this is her," the woman said, her voice clipped and dismissive. "The waitress gambit. Julian, this is absurd. We have teams of M&A specialists, and you've staked our opening move on a server you hired out of a restaurant." "Eleanor, this is Clara Evans," Julian said, his tone unwavering. "Clara, my sister, Eleanor Caldwell. She's the COO of the company and the voice of reason I occasionally choose to ignore." Eleanor gave Clara a curt nod, her handshake firm and brief. "My brother has a flair for the dramatic. He sees patterns where others see chaos. Let's hope for all our sakes that this time he isn't just seeing what he wants to see." She turned her sharp eyes back on Clara. "Madame Dubois is a formidable woman. She will eat you alive if she senses you are anything other than what you appear to be. What exactly are you supposed to be, Miss Evans? A good listener, I hope, Clara replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Julian watched the exchange, his expression unreadable. A room has been prepared for you. I had some items sent over. I trust they will be adequate. We'll convene in the library after your dinner to debrief. The mystery was only deepening, and as a housekeeper led her up the stairs to a beautifully appointed suite overlooking the vineyards, Clara realized she had been dropped behind enemy lines with no map, no weapons, and no allies. This wasn't a test, it was a suicide mission. Clara awoke in a bed so vast and comfortable it felt like a cloud. Morning light, tinged with the green of the surrounding vineyards, filtered through the tall windows of her suite. The events of the previous night played back in her mind like a fever dream. The dinner with Madame Dubois had been a masterclass in psychological chess. The old woman had been charming, witty, and relentlessly probing. She had asked about Clara's family, her education, her life in Chicago, all in French. She never once mentioned Julian Caldwell or his company, but the entire conversation was an interrogation, a delicate search for the truth of who Clara was. Clara had answered honestly, speaking of her grandmother, her abandoned studies, and the history of her family's bookstore. She spoke of her love for old books and the stories they held. She could feel Madame Dubois weighing every word, searching for any hint of a corporate script. By the end of the evening, the old woman had simply patted her hand and said, "You have an old soul, my child. It is a rare thing these days." It wasn't an acceptance, but it wasn't a rejection either. Now, dressed in a simple silk blouse and tailored trousers that had been laid out for her, part of the wardrobe Julian had mysteriously provided, she made her way to the chateau's library. It was a magnificent two-story room lined with ceiling-high shelves of leather-bound books. The air smelled of old paper, beeswax, and wood smoke from a small, crackling fire in the hearth. Julian and Eleanor were there, standing before a large table covered in maps and documents. Eleanor, holding a tablet, immediately went on the offensive. "She charmed you," Eleanor stated, not looking up from her screen. "Geneviève Dubois is a professional charmer. It's how she has kept corporate raiders at bay for 40 years. She flatters, she disarms, and then she dismisses. What did you actually accomplish?" "I listened," Clara said simply. "We talked about her great-grandfather, who founded the vineyard. We talked about the phylloxera epidemic in the 1880s. We talked about the specific blend of grapes she uses in her premier cru." Julian looked up from a map, his gaze sharp. "And what did you learn?" "I learned that she sees this chateau not as a business, but as a living entity, a relative. She sees a sale not as a transaction, but as a betrayal of the dead," Clara explained. "She believes a company like Caldwell Industries, a company that deals in logistics and code, could never understand a legacy that is rooted in soil and blood." "Sentimental nonsense," Eleanor scoffed. "It's a negotiating tactic. She wants to drive up the price." "No, I don't think it is," Clara countered, her confidence growing. "In her study, she has all the vineyard's original ledgers. I saw them. They date back to the 1790s. The history is everything to her. Your offer, your language, it's all about the future. You haven't shown any respect for the past." Julian was silent for a long moment, studying Clara. "The past," he mused. "Our research teams have compiled a complete history. We know every owner, every vintage, every award." "You know the fact," Clara said, stepping closer to the table. "But you don't know the story. There's a difference." Eleanor let out an exasperated sigh. "This is a waste of time. We have a meeting with her and her board, which consists of her two equally difficult sons, in 2 hours. We are going to present our final offer, which is more than generous. If she rejects it, we move on. The market is full of other vineyards." "But none like this one," Julian said softly, his eyes still on Clara. "There's something else, isn't there? Something you're not telling us." Clara hesitated. During her tour of the study, she had noticed something odd. A framed map on the wall, dating from the early 19th century, showed the vineyard's property lines. But in the oldest ledger, she had seen a hand-drawn sketch from the 1790s that showed a small, additional parcel of land, marked with a peculiar symbol. The symbol was familiar to her from her studies. It denoted a terroir d'exception, a plot of land with unique geological properties, officially recognized by royal decree. That parcel was not on the modern maps. "There's a discrepancy in the historical records of the property," she said carefully. "A piece of land that seems to have vanished from the official surveys." Eleanor rolled her eyes. "A clerical error from 200 years ago is not going to close a nine-figure deal, Miss Evans. Let's focus on the present." The meeting was held in the chateau's formal dining room. It was a bloodbath. Eleanor, taking the lead, delivered a flawless, logical presentation. She spoke of global distribution networks, of capital investment in new technology, of securing the chateau's financial future for generations to come. It was a brilliant corporate strategy, and it landed with a deafening thud. Madame Dubois and her sons listened with stony faces. When Eleanor finished, the matriarch simply shook her head. "Mademoiselle Caldwell," she said, her voice laced with icy disappointment, "you speak of our home as if it were a software company in need of an upgrade. You talk of efficiency and expansion. My great-grandfather did not stare down a plague that destroyed half the vineyards in Europe so that his legacy could be scaled. The answer is no. This discussion is over." A stunned silence fell over the room. Eleanor's face was pale with fury. The lawyers from their team began shuffling their papers, defeated. It was a complete and utter failure. This was it. Clara's chance was over. She would be on a plane back to Chicago, back to the Gilded Quill by nightfall. But as Madame Dubois made to stand, a desperate idea, born of her scholarly instincts, seized Clara. She saw the old ledger in her mind's eye, the faded ink, the strange symbol. "Madame Dubois," Clara said, her voice cutting through the tense silence. Everyone turned to look at her, the insignificant waitress at the end of the table. Julian's eyes widened slightly, giving her an almost imperceptible nod. "Permission." She stood, her heart hammering. She spoke in French, her tone not one of negotiation, but of academic inquiry. "Madam, forgive me. Before you go, could you indulge a scholar's curiosity? In your oldest ledger, there is a map. It shows a small parcel of land, south of the main vineyard, marked with the seal of a royal charter from King Louis XVI, a terroir d'exception." The room went completely still. Madame Dubois slowly sank back into her chair, her eyes fixed on Clara, her expression one of utter shock. "How do you know of this?" she whispered. "I recognize the seal," Clara continued, her voice gaining strength. "That charter would have granted your family sole rights to that land and its unique geology, protecting it from acquisition or dispute forever. It's a legacy more powerful than any title of nobility. But the parcel of land isn't on any modern maps. The charter, is it lost?" Madame Dubois' son, Antoine, a grim-faced man in his 50s, scoffed. "It is a family legend, mademoiselle, a fairy tale. The charter was lost during the Revolution. The land was likely absorbed by our neighbors generations ago." "A legend is just a history that has lost its proof," Clara said, her eyes locked with Madame Dubois. She was gambling everything on a scholar's hunch. "But the proof is sometimes hiding in plain sight." "Ledgers, madame. Your library is full of them. A royal charter from that era would not have been a grand, scrolled document. For safety, it would have been bound into an unassuming book, disguised as something mundane, something like a vineyard's financial ledger." The implication hung in the air, electric. Geneviève Dubois stared at Clara, her mind clearly racing back through the generations of stories, through the countless hours spent in her study among her family's books. A flicker of something, disbelief, hope, awe, crossed her ancient features. She stood up, her movements suddenly energized. "Venez," she commanded. "Come." She led them, not just Clara, but a bewildered Julian and a thunderstruck Eleanor, out of the dining room and into her private study. She walked to a glass-fronted bookshelf and pointed a trembling finger. "The ledgers from the first generation. They are all there." Clara's hands were surprisingly steady as Antoine retrieved the heavy, leather-bound volumes. There were 3 from the correct period. She opened the first one, financial records. The second, the same. But as she opened the third, she knew. The paper was different, thicker, more fibrous. The ink was darker. The first few pages were indeed records of grape harvests and cask sales. But then, tucked between a page detailing the sale of wine to a local aristocrat and one tallying the cost of new barrels, was the document. It was written in the elaborate formal script of the Ancien Regime, and at the bottom was the unmistakable, faded but still legible signature of Louis XVII and the heavy embossed royal seal. It was the charter. It granted the Dubois family and their descendants, in perpetuity, ownership of the small 3-hectare plot of land, a unique geological anomaly whose limestone-rich soil was unlike any other in the region. "My God," Julian breathed, staring at the document. Eleanor was speechless, her corporate certainty utterly shattered. Clara ran her finger gently over the faded script. "It's here. It's been here all along." She looked at Madame Dubois, whose eyes were filled with tears. "Your legacy isn't lost, Madame. It was just waiting to be read." The discovery of the charter changed everything. It was not just a historical curiosity, it was a legal atomic bomb. The lost parcel of land, which had been fallow for decades and considered part of a neighboring property, was indisputably theirs, and its unique soil composition, as confirmed by a frantic series of geological tests Julian commissioned, made it arguably one of Saluto, the most valuable unplanted vineyard plots in the world. The value of Chateau Dubois hadn't just increased, it had become almost priceless. Marcus Thorne, the odious developer from the restaurant, was by a twist of cruel fate the principal owner of the neighboring property. He had been trying for years to acquire the chateau through aggressive lowball offers, assuming its value was limited. The charter had not only resurrected the Dubois family's claim, but had also exposed Thorne's attempts to devalue their land as legally baseless. The news would ruin him. It was a justice so poetic, Clara could only marvel at it. The negotiation was no longer an acquisition, it became a partnership. Caldwell Industries would provide the capital to cultivate the new plot and modernize distribution, but the Dubois family would retain majority ownership and complete creative control. Geneviève Dubois had one non-negotiable condition. Clara Evans was to be appointed as the Director of Historical Heritage for the new joint venture. She would be the guardian of the chateau's legacy, the bridge between its storied past and its technological future. That evening, Julian found Clara standing on a balcony overlooking the vineyards, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. For a long time, they stood in a comfortable silence, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. "You did it," he said finally, his voice filled with a genuine admiration that went beyond a mere business victory. "I bring in an army of lawyers and financial analysts, and you defeat them all with a 300-year-old piece of paper." "I just read the book," she replied softly. "It was all there." "I brought you here as a tool, Clara," he confessed, turning to face her. "A key to unlock a door I couldn't open. It was a cold calculation. But I was wrong. You're not a key. You're the architect. You didn't just open a door, you rebuilt the entire house on a stronger foundation." He extended his hand. "The position Madame Dubois created is yours, of course, with a salary and benefits package that will ensure your grandmother receives the best care in the world for as long as she needs it. All of it." This was the moment, the fairy tale ending, the reward for her impossible gamble. But the woman who had walked into that restaurant a few days ago was not the same woman standing on this balcony. The scholar, the fighter, the woman of value. She was fully awake now. She looked at his outstretched hand but didn't take it. "Thank you, Julian, but I have a counter-proposal." He raised an eyebrow, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. It was the first time she had seen him look truly relaxed, truly happy. "I should have expected as much. I'm listening." "I'll accept the position," she said, her voice firm and clear. "But I don't want it as a gift from you or a demand from Madame Dubois. I want to earn it. I want a performance-based contract, and I want to create a foundation funded by a small percentage of the profits from this new premier Quarrieu, the Dubois Charter Foundation. Its mission will be to help other small, historic family-owned vineyards and businesses digitize and preserve their archives. to find the lost charters in their own histories so they can never be bullied or bought out by men like Marcus Thorne. She was asking for more than a job. She was asking for a mission, a way to turn her unique skills into a shield for others like her family who had lost everything. Julian's smile widened. He dropped his hand and simply applauded, a slow, deliberate clap that echoed in the quiet evening air. A waitress from Chicago who I met less than a week ago is now creating philanthropic foundations and negotiating legacy clauses in a multi-million-dollar partnership, he said, shaking his head in wonder. My instincts are rarely this good. He looked at her, his analytical gaze gone, replaced by something warmer, something that looked suspiciously like respect. You have a deal, Director Evans, on all of it. Clara finally took his hand, and the handshake was not one of employment, but of partnership. It was the closing of a painful chapter and the explosive, brilliant beginning of a new one. She was no longer a ghost haunting the edges of her own life. She had found her voice, deciphered her own hidden script, and in doing so, had reclaimed not just her future, but her past. And as she looked out over the ancient land, she knew she was, at long last, finally home.